Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we uncover the divine secret buried beneath Medusa's curse, not the monster, but the mortal woman she once was, beautiful and beloved, before the gods turned her beauty into a weapon. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the sounds of the world outside grow very distant now. Whatever was pressing on your thoughts this evening, whatever remained unfinished, whatever lingered at the edges of your mind, you may set it down gently. Just for a little while. You do not need to carry it into this space. We are going somewhere older tonight. Much older. We are going to a time before the word monster meant what we think it means. A time when the gods moved through the world like weather, powerful and indifferent and sometimes terribly beautiful. A time when a young woman stood in a marble temple with salt wind in her hair and did not yet know what was coming. She was not always what the myths say she was. Before the serpents, before the gaze that could stop a heart, before the hero and the shield and the sword, there was a girl. There was beauty, and there was worship, and there was a sacred place where she once felt safe. And there was a goddess who had given that girl everything, and then, in one awful moment, took something away that could never be returned. Tonight, we follow the whole thread. From the beginning. From before the beginning, even, back through ocean mist and divine genealogy to understand not simply what Medusa became, but who she was, and why that matters, and what her story has always quietly been trying to say. Breathe in slowly. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The story is already beginning, soft and ancient, carried on the kind of air that only moves at night. Part 1: The World at the Edge of the Sea. What does it feel like to be born at the edge of the world? Not the edge of a country, or the edge of a known road. The actual edge, where the sea becomes something other than sea, where the light bends strangely and the air carries no bird sound and the horizon is not a line so much as a question. That is where Medusa came from. Or rather, that is where her family came from, which amounts to much the same thing. To understand who she was before the curse, we must understand the blood she carried and the world that made her, and that world was stranger and older than almost anything in the Greek mythological tradition. Her parents were Phorcys and Ceto. Say those names quietly to yourself if you like. Phorcys. Ceto. They are ancient names, far older than the Olympian gods, rooted in the primordial layers of Greek cosmology where the world was still sorting itself into recognizable shapes. Phorcys was a sea god, not the warm, dolphin-accompanied sea god of summer. He was the god of the hidden dangers of the deep. The rocks beneath the surface. The current that pulls without warning. The darkness below the light where the water grows cold and still. He was sometimes depicted as an old man with crabclaw hands and a body that shifted between human and fish without ever committing fully to either form. He was not evil. Evil is too simple a word for what Phorcys represented. He was simply the sea's darker nature, the part of it that does not care whether you are beautiful or brave or beloved. The part that simply takes. His consort, Ceto, was just as ancient and just as strange. Her name became attached to great sea monsters. The word cetacean, meaning whale, echoes her across millennia, and she embodied the ocean's most terrifying aspects. Its vastness. its capacity for swallowing things whole, its blind, enormous patience. Together, Phorcys and Ceto produced some of the most remarkable and uncanny beings in all of Greek mythology. Their family was not a family of heroes or craftsmen or poets. It was a family of thresholds, of things that exist at the border between the understood and the incomprehensible. Among their children were the Grii, the Grey Ones, 3 ancient women born already old, with a single eye and a single tooth between them, which they passed from hand to hand in the dark. They were oracles of a kind, keepers of knowledge that no one who was fully comfortable would ever want to seek. They lived in a place of permanent twilight, neither day nor night, and they saw, or rather, one of them saw, at any given moment, in ways that defied ordinary sight. There were also the Hesperides in some traditions, the nymphs of the evening who tended the golden apple tree at the world's western rim. And the Ladon, the great serpent who coiled around that same tree. And Echidna, the mother of monsters, half woman and half serpent, who would herself give birth to creatures that haunted the Greek imagination for generations. And then there were the Gorgons. 3 sisters, born of Phorcys and Ceto, given names that resonate across time like the sound of a gong struck in an empty temple. Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. Stheno and Euryale were immortal from birth. The traditions are fairly consistent on this point. Whatever they were, however strange or fearsome, they could not die. They existed in that permanent way that certain ancient things exist, simply present, without beginning or foreseeable end. But Medusa was mortal. This small detail, mortal, among immortal sisters, is perhaps one of the most important things to understand about her. She was not separate from her family, not lesser or weaker in any obvious way. But she was singular among the Gorgons in her vulnerability. She could be killed. She could suffer. She could change. And she did. But not yet. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, before the curse and the serpents and the story that most people know, there are older accounts, fragmentary, partial, carried in the works of Pindar and Ovid and Apollodorus and in references scattered across ancient texts like seeds blown across stone, that speak of Medusa differently. In these older tellings, she was beautiful. Not in a threatening way. Not in the way that myths sometimes describe beauty as a weapon or a trap. Simply beautiful, the way the sea her parents embodied was beautiful, with that particular quality that belongs to things that are powerful and wild and not quite within the reach of ordinary human experience. She had long hair. This detail will become terribly important later. Dark hair, in most descriptions, though some traditions suggest she was golden-haired, the color of seafoam light on a clear afternoon. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of deep water where it meets shallow. She was tall and poised in the way of someone who has grown up at the world's edge, who has learned to stand in wind. She was, in the older fragments, a priestess. Or something like a priestess. A devotee of ATHENA, which is itself a significant detail, one that carries the weight of dramatic irony in the most ancient and quiet sense. She had chosen to dedicate herself to a goddess of wisdom and war, of crafts and measured thought. She had entered the sacred space of Athena's temple in a spirit of genuine reverence. She was not there for power or recognition. She was there because she believed in something larger than herself, and the goddess seemed to offer a path toward that something. She could not have known what that choice would eventually cost her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The story has its own pace, and it rewards patience. Let us stay, for a little longer, in the world of her childhood. She grew up, we must imagine, in a place of relentless strangeness. Her parents were not gods who strolled among mortals and attended festivals and laughed at banquets on Olympus. They were the deep. They were the sea's mystery. The world of their household was one of salt and shadow and the kind of beauty that exists in things humans rarely get close enough to observe, the bioluminescent drift of deep ocean creatures, the geometry of seafloor formations, the way the water absorbs all color below a certain depth until everything becomes the same shade of profound blue. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were her companions in this world. Older. Immortal. Perhaps already showing, in small ways, the signs of what they would eventually fully become. The Gorgon nature was not something applied from outside. It was always in them, the way the grain of unusual wood becomes more visible as it ages. Medusa, mortal and therefore somehow more immediate in her personhood, was perhaps more curious than her sisters. More drawn to the world beyond the sea's edge. More interested in the great stories that traveled across the water, stories of Olympus and its dramas, of temples built in light-flooded cities, of human beings who wove and prayed and created beautiful things out of ordinary materials. At some point, and the myths do not give us a precise moment, because myths rarely concern themselves with the precision of calendars, she left the edge of the world. She came inland. Or she came to the coast where the world became inhabited. And she found her way to a temple. And that is where the real story begins. Part 2, The Temple of Athena and a Life of Devotion. There is a quality to ancient temples that we can only approximate now. We can visit ruins, walk across stone floors worn smooth by millennia of sandaled feet, stand between great columns and feel the heat of the Mediterranean sun, but we cannot entirely recover what those spaces felt like when they were alive and sacred and continuously inhabited by divine presence. They were not simply buildings. They were, in the understanding of the people who built and used them, actual homes for the gods. Actual thresholds between the mortal world and the divine one. The Temple of Athena in the tradition surrounding Medusa's story is most often placed in a coastal setting. Some accounts specify Athens and its great Acropolis, with the salt wind coming up from the harbor and the olive trees silvering in the light. Other accounts are vaguer, suggesting simply a temple dedicated to the gray-eyed goddess somewhere near the sea. This coastal detail is interesting, and perhaps not coincidental. Medusa was the daughter of sea gods. Even as she moved toward the worship of Athena, a goddess of craft and wisdom and the ordered city, values that might seem opposed to the wild ocean, she remained, in some sense, a creature of the liminal. Of the in-between. The temple near the sea was perhaps the closest she could come to being in two worlds at once. Athena was, at this point in the mythology, one of the great and powerful Olympian goddesses. She had been born in a remarkable way, springing fully formed and armored from the forehead of Zeus after he swallowed her mother Metis, a titan of wisdom, because he feared the child might surpass him. The birth was attended by the other gods with a mixture of awe and discomfort, which is perhaps appropriate for a goddess of contradictions. Athena was a goddess of war, but not the war of fury and bloodlust, that was Ares's domain. She was the war of strategy, of the thoughtful commander who wins through intelligence rather than through force alone. She was a goddess of crafts, of weaving and pottery, and the kind of skilled making that transforms raw material into beauty and utility. She was a goddess of wisdom, of the owl that sees in darkness, of the olive tree that sustains life through drought. She was also a virgin goddess. This matters significantly to the story. Her identity was wound tightly around her inviolability, her complete and permanent autonomy over her own person. It was not simply a rule she followed. It was fundamental to who she was. Other goddesses might love, might desire, might be pursued and sometimes caught in the divine dramas of Olympus. Athena did not. She was armored against that particular kind of vulnerability in a way that even the other gods understood was absolute. She demanded similar devotion from her priestesses. Those who served in her temples were expected to reflect her values, wisdom, purity, dedicated craft. They were sacred, protected by the goddess's name and authority, set apart from ordinary life in a way that was understood and respected across the ancient world. Medusa, in coming to this temple, was placing herself under this protection. She was also, in a sense, placing herself inside a story that was already in motion. The temple was not simply a place of worship. It was a place of negotiation between the mortal world and the divine one. A place where the gods were acknowledged and appeased and sometimes, in their own distant and inscrutable way, acknowledged back. She would have learned the rituals. The particular prayers, spoken in certain ways at certain times of day. The careful management of the sacred flame, which was never allowed to go out. The weaving of offerings, the pouring of libations, the reading of omens in the way oil moved in water or the way particular birds crossed the sky at particular hours. She would have learned the particular qualities of Athena's attention. The goddess was generous to those who proved themselves worthy, who showed intelligence and dedication and the kind of quiet excellence that did not need to announce itself. She was less forgiving of those who wasted her gifts or failed to honor the sacred boundaries she kept. For a time, perhaps a long time, the myths do not give us a clear duration, Medusa lived this life. The life of the devoted. The life of the priestess in the beautiful temple near the sea, with her strange and ancient blood running quietly beneath her surface and her genuine piety offering something to the goddess who watched. She was noticed, in this period, for her beauty. The ancient sources that speak to this phase of her life are consistent on this point. She was remarkable to look at, in a way that caused people to stop and reconsider what they had expected. Visitors to the temple would catch sight of her and forget momentarily why they had come. Sailors who could see the temple from the water would feel something watching them from that direction that they could not quite name. The dark hair was what people remembered most, in many of the older accounts. It was extraordinary hair, not simply long but somehow alive in the way it moved, the way it caught the light, the way it seemed to belong to a person whose relationship with beauty was not entirely ordinary. She was proud of it. Not vainly, or at least not in the way that the later moralistic tellings sometimes suggest. But she was aware of it, the way a person raised near the sea is aware of the particular quality of the light on the water, as something that is simply part of the world as she experienced it, beautiful and significant and worth paying attention to. There are accounts in which she expressed something like gratitude for her beauty, or made comparisons, perhaps unwise comparisons, that would later be held against her. The tradition surrounding Ovid's telling in the Metamorphoses contains a reference to pride in her hair specifically, which will become the axis around which the divine punishment rotates. But for now she was simply herself, a mortal woman of remarkable origins, in a sacred place, living carefully inside the protection of a powerful goddess's name. The sea was behind her. The olive trees were before her. The sky was full of a particular Mediterranean blue that belongs to that part of the world at certain hours of certain seasons. She did not know, as she moved through her mornings of prayer and her evenings of careful ritual, that the gods were already intersecting her life. She did not know that one god in particular had begun to look at her. And that the problem was not the gods looking. The problem was where he decided to act on what he saw. Part 3: Poseidon and the violation of sacred ground. There is a question that floats through the ancient traditions like foam on a wave, never quite resolving: did the gods understand what was sacred to each other? Not in the abstract. The gods certainly understood the concept of sacred space. They maintained their own domains with fierce attention, and Olympus itself was a kind of permanent sacred ground where certain rules applied that did not apply elsewhere. But in the specific, particular sense, did any given god, in any given moment of desire or impulse, pause and consider what his actions meant in relation to another god's protected realm? The story of what happened in Athena's temple suggests the answer was sometimes no. Poseidon was not a small god. He was not a figure of secondary importance or limited reach. He was one of the three great brothers who had divided the world among themselves after the defeat of the Titans: Zeus to the sky, Hades to the underworld, and Poseidon to the sea and all the waters of the earth. His domain was immense, literally surrounding the inhabited world in the Greek geographical imagination, which pictured the land of mortals as an island within the great ocean river. He was powerful and temperamental in ways that made even the other Olympians cautious. His anger could produce earthquakes. The ancient Greeks called him the earthshaker, Enosigaios, and this was not a poetic flourish but a literal description of what his displeasure could accomplish. He had fought with Athena for the patronage of Athens itself, losing when the Athenians chose her gift of the olive tree over his gift of a saltwater spring. He had never entirely forgiven that particular defeat. He was also capable of great desire. Many of the myths surrounding Poseidon involve his pursuit of those he found beautiful, nymphs and goddesses and mortal women who appear in the stories as brief flashes of individual personhood before being absorbed into the larger narrative of his wanting. He fathered enormous numbers of children in these traditions, not all of them welcomed by their mothers. He was, in other words, the kind of force that could not be reasoned with in the usual way, because he was not accustomed to reasoning with himself about these matters. He was the sea. He moved where he moved. Medusa, daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, therefore had an uncomfortable relationship to Poseidon's world. She was, through her parents, connected to the sea. Her blood was ocean dark, her origins were in the deepest waters. There may have been a sense, in Poseidon's mythological logic, that she was already somehow his, that a daughter of the sea's mystery belonged in some way to the sea's king. This logic, if it can be called that, did not survive contact with reality. Medusa had made choices. She had chosen Athena's temple. She had placed herself under the goddess's protection. She had, by any reasonable reading of the sacred laws that governed the Greek divine world, removed herself from the kind of approach Poseidon was contemplating. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, as ancient accounts often do, told and retold across centuries, filtered through different poets and different agendas and different understandings of what mythology was supposed to accomplish. But the essential event is consistent across the major sources, and it is this. Poseidon came to the temple of Athena. He came not to pray or to honor his fellow Olympian. He came because Medusa was there, and he wanted her there, and in the way of immense and unchecked power, he did not allow the sacred walls around her to stop him. What exactly occurred within those walls, the ancient sources are, depending on the telling, either explicit or carefully euphemistic. Ovid, writing in the Roman tradition that inherited and reinterpreted the Greek myths, says simply that Poseidon seized Medusa in the temple, in the sacred space itself, in the place that was supposed to be protected by the presence of Athena above all other places on earth. The violation had two layers, and this is important to understand for everything that follows. The first was the violation of Medusa herself, a person, mortal and vulnerable and dedicated to a goddess, in a place she had believed was safe. The second was the violation of the temple, of the sacred space, of the goddess's house, of the inviolable ground that Athena had staked her divine identity on maintaining. These two violations were, in the architecture of the ancient myth, inseparable. And how the goddess responded to both of them, or rather, how she responded to only one of them, and which one, is where the story begins to darken in a way that still resonates. Medusa, in the aftermath of this event, remained in the temple. Where else would she have gone? She was a priestess. The temple was her world. And perhaps she believed, perhaps she needed to believe, that the goddess who had protected her would understand what had happened. That Athena, who was herself fiercely protective of her own inviolability, would extend some measure of that protection to the one who had been violated within her walls. But Athena was already angry. The ancient sources vary on the exact nature of the goddess's anger and what specifically triggered it. Some traditions focus on Athena's fury at the desecration of her temple. Others suggest a more complex divine emotion, something that included shame, which is an interesting attribute to assign to a goddess, and which tells us something about the way the ancient Greeks understood both divine and mortal responses to the violation of sacred space. In some readings, Athena's anger was directed at Poseidon, whom she could not easily punish. He was her equal in divine status, her uncle, one of the three great brothers who ruled the world. To move against him directly would have been to invite a conflict that had no easy resolution. So she looked for something she could reach. And what she could reach was the person who had been in her temple when the desecration occurred. And that person was Medusa. Part 4: The Goddess in Her Fury. What does divine anger feel like in the ancient imagination? It does not arrive the way human anger does, hot and immediate and often regretted afterward. Divine anger, in the Greek mythological tradition, is more like weather. It builds. It gathers. And when it breaks, it transforms the landscape it crosses. Athena's anger at the violation of her temple was of this nature. We are told, in the fragments that survive, that she was furious, not simply offended, not simply displeased, but genuinely enraged in a way that shook the air inside the sacred columns and made the sacred flame bend sideways though there was no wind. The goddess of wisdom was also the goddess of war. People sometimes focus on one of these aspects at the expense of the other, but they were genuinely inseparable in her divine character. Her wisdom did not prevent her wrath. It simply shaped the instrument of it. She considered her position. Poseidon had violated her sacred ground. He had brought his desire and his power into the space she had made inviolable, and he had demonstrated, deliberately or carelessly, it almost didn't matter, that he did not consider her sanctity a real constraint on his actions. She could not destroy him. The balance of divine power did not allow for that kind of response, and Athena was intelligent enough to understand that an open conflict with one of the three great brothers would have consequences for the order of the world that extended far beyond any particular grievance. She could go to Zeus. But Zeus was Poseidon's brother, and the history of Zeus's own relationships with mortal women and sacred spaces was not exactly a history that invited his moral authority on this particular subject. And Medusa was there. Now, here is where the mythology becomes genuinely complex, and where we must sit with the discomfort of what the ancient sources actually record, without trying to rush past it or tidy it into a simpler moral. Athena punished Medusa. The precise reasoning the goddess gave, or the reasoning the ancient storytellers assigned to her, differed across traditions. One reading, and this is the reading that has troubled scholars and readers for centuries, suggested that Medusa had in some way invited what happened, or had failed to resist it adequately, or that by being beautiful in the temple she had created the conditions for the violation of that sacred space. Another reading, perhaps more ancient and therefore harder to recover precisely, suggested that Athena's punishment was not truly about Medusa's behavior at all. That it was about the goddess's own humiliation, and that Medusa was simply the instrument available for expressing a divine fury that could not be properly directed at its actual cause. A third reading, which appears in some of the more sympathetic retellings, suggested that Athena's punishment was a kind of terrible protection, that by transforming Medusa into something fearsome and unapproachable, the goddess was, in her own distorted way, ensuring that no one would ever do to Medusa what had been done to her again. All three of these readings exist within the mythological tradition. They are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Mythology does not operate by the logic of legal argument. It operates by the logic of the dream, layered, contradictory, emotionally coherent even when rationally inconsistent. What is consistent is the outcome. Athena stood before Medusa in the violated temple, and the goddess's gray eyes, those famous gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the sea, were cold and bright with something that mortals were not designed to fully comprehend. She did not strike her down. She did not exile her simply. She did something more permanent and more strange. She transformed her. The transformation was not instantaneous in all accounts, but it was irreversible. And it began, in the most resonant tellings, with the hair. The dark hair, the hair Medusa had perhaps been unwise enough to be proud of, the hair that visitors had marveled at, the hair that had perhaps been part of how she came to Poseidon's notice in the first place, was the first thing the goddess changed. Snake by snake. Or all at once, in a wave of divine power. The accounts differ. But the image is the same, where the dark hair had been, there were now serpents. Living serpents, coiled and hissing, their scales catching the temple light, their small bright eyes alert and cold, their movements constant and restless across the surface of her skull. This image, the serpent hair, is perhaps the most iconic element of the Gorgon transformation in all of Western visual culture. It appears in artwork across the entire arc of the ancient Mediterranean world, and it continues to appear in art and literature and film and poetry in the modern world, centuries and millennia later. It is one of those mythological images that lodges itself in the human imagination and refuses to be dislodged. But the hair was not the only change. The face changed too. The accounts describe a process of transformation that made the face of Medusa, which had been beautiful in the way of her strange ocean-born heritage, into something that human beings could not look at directly. Something that overloaded the perceptual capacity, that confronted the viewer with too much reality to process safely. Her eyes, specifically, became the center of the Gorgon's terrible power. The gaze that could turn a living person to stone. This detail, the petrifying gaze, is rich with symbolic possibility, and we will return to it. For now, simply sit with the image, a young woman who had chosen wisdom and devotion, standing in the ruins of her sacred life, looking at her reflection in the dark bronze of a ritual vessel and seeing something she no longer recognized. She had come to the temple as a mortal woman with ocean-dark hair and gray-green eyes. She left it as something the Greeks called gorgon, from the ancient word for fierce, or terrible, or dreadful. A word that vibrated with a kind of primal alarm. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, the immortal ones, received transformations too in some accounts. Whether simultaneously or through some sympathetic divine action is unclear. Or perhaps they had always appeared as they now appeared, and only the addition of Medusa to their number made the whole arrangement visible. The three Gorgons would eventually withdraw to the far west, to the edge of the world again, to the place near the Garden of the Hesperides, near the home of the Graeae, near the great ocean that circled the inhabited lands. They would return, in a sense, to the world of their parents, where the light was different and the rules of ordinary reality bent slightly in directions that defied explanation. But before they went, before all of that, Medusa stood in the temple. She stood in the place that had been sacred to her, where she had poured libations and tended the flame and believed that she was protected. And the goddess was gone. And the serpents moved in the place where her hair had been. And the world outside the temple columns looked exactly the same as it had before, the olive trees, the Mediterranean sky, the distant line of the sea. But nothing was the same. Part 5. What the curse actually means. There is a way of hearing the Medusa story that ends with the transformation. Beautiful girl, prideful in her beauty, violated in a sacred space, punished by the goddess who owned that space. Transformed into a monster. Story over, next myth please. But that reading moves too quickly. It skips the most interesting question, which is this: what does the curse actually mean? Not in the modern sense of trying to extract a feminist reading or a sociological lesson, though those readings are not without value. But in the mythological sense. What is Athena's transformation of Medusa communicating about the ancient Greek understanding of beauty, of divine power, of the relationship between mortals and gods, of what it means to be changed by something beyond your control? Let us begin with the serpents. In the ancient world, serpents carried a complex and layered symbolic weight. They were associated with chthonic power, the power of the earth and the underworld, of forces that moved through the soil and the dark below the inhabited surface. They were associated with wisdom. Paradoxically, the serpent in the Garden of Eden in the Hebrew tradition, the serpent coiled around Asclepius's staff in the Greek tradition, the serpent wisdom of Athena herself, who was sometimes depicted with a great serpent as her companion. They were also associated with transformation, with shedding skin and being reborn in a new form. They were symbols of eternity, the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, and of healing and medicine and the borderline between life and death. When Athena replaced Medusa's hair with serpents, she was not simply creating an ugliness. She was encoding a meaning. The serpents were Medusa's new nature expressed in visible form, chthonic, powerful, connected to the earth's dark mysteries, endlessly in motion. The hair, specifically, matters here. Hair in the ancient world was a site of enormous symbolic significance. It was associated with power and identity and the self. Cutting hair marked transitions, entry into sacred service, mourning for the dead, the completion of a vow. To touch someone's hair was intimate. To be robbed of it was violating. To have it become serpents was to have the most personal, most visible, most self-signifying part of your appearance transformed into something alive and alien and no longer fully yours. The serpents moved of their own accord. Medusa could not simply arrange them or tie them back or let them catch the light the way she had her dark hair. They were themselves, curling and tasting the air, pursuing their own serpent purposes on the surface of her skull. There is something about this particular image that speaks to the experience of transformation by external force, of having the self you thought you knew become something unfamiliar and impossible to fully control. Then there is the gaze. The power of Medusa's eyes, the ability to turn living things to stone, is one of the most discussed elements of the myth. It has been interpreted in so many ways, across so many centuries, that it has accumulated layers of meaning like sediment. In the straightforward mythological reading, the gaze is part of the curse. Medusa became dangerous to look at, which is both her punishment and the mechanism of her isolation. No one could safely approach her. No one could fully see her. She was condemned to be perpetually invisible even in plain sight, because no set of eyes could safely open in her presence. But there is a deeper resonance. What is it to have a gaze that destroys? In many of the ancient traditions, the gods themselves had gazes that were not safe for mortals. Artemis's wrath at being observed bathing transformed Actaeon into a stag. The divine gaze was powerful and dangerous. To be seen by a god at the wrong moment was perilous. Medusa's transformation gave her a version of this divine quality, the dangerous gaze, but without the divine status to accompany it. She was still mortal. She could still be killed. She had the power of a god's most dangerous aspect without the immortality that made divine power something other than vulnerability. She was, in a sense, trapped. Her power isolated her. Her mortality made her reachable. She existed in the worst possible middle space, powerful enough to be feared and hunted, mortal enough to be destroyed. And there is one more layer to the gaze that is worth sitting with. In the later tradition, the only way to safely look at Medusa was in reflection. Perseus, the hero who would eventually come to kill her, used a polished shield as a mirror, navigating by the Gorgon's image in the bronze surface rather than looking at her directly. To see her real face was death. To see her reflection was safety. This distinction, between direct sight and reflected sight, resonates deeply in the mythological imagination. It suggests something about the nature of overwhelming experience, of things too large or too terrible or too transformative to be directly confronted. Sometimes the only way to approach something is sideways, in reflection, at a remove that makes it bearable. What else does this remind you of? The ancient Greeks used mirrors made of polished bronze. The image you saw in them was not sharp or detailed. It was slightly distorted, slightly softened, the colors muted. It was recognizably you, but not completely. It was a version of you, mediated by a surface. Medusa, transformed into something too terrible to look at directly, could only be approached through this kind of mediated vision. Which is, perhaps, one way to understand the role that myth itself plays in human experience. We approach certain truths, about violence and divine indifference and the transformation of identity by forces beyond our control, sideways. In story. Reflected back to us through the polished surface of narrative. And so we circle the myth itself, the way Perseus circled the Gorgon, careful not to look directly at the thing we are trying to understand. Let us look a little longer anyway. Part 6, The World of the Gorgons and the Weight of Exile. To be exiled is one thing. To be exiled and to carry the reason for your exile in your face is another thing entirely. Medusa and her sisters, Stheno, the strong one, Euryale, the Farspringer, withdrew to the western margins of the world. The mythological geography of this location is consistent across the major sources. They lived at the edge of the world, near Oceanus, near the perpetual twilight that existed in a place neither fully day nor fully night. This is the same region as the Graeae, their kinswomen with the shared iron tooth. This is the same region as the Hesperides and their golden apple tree. The western edge of the Greek mythological world was a kind of gathering place for creatures who were between things, between human and divine, between comprehensible and incomprehensible, between living and something else. The Gorgon's lair, in the ancient imagination, was a place of stone. Not stone as architecture, not the warm marble of temples and public buildings. Stone as the final state of things that had been living once. The landscape around where Medusa lived was described, in some accounts, as littered with the forms of animals and men who had approached too closely and met her gaze. Stone lions. Stone deer. Stone sailors who had perhaps come ashore in the wrong place at the wrong time and paid for the navigation error with their living substance. This landscape is heartbreaking, if you sit with it. Every one of those stone forms was once a living thing. Every one of them approached Medusa, however accidentally, however carelessly, however bravely, and was stopped permanently in the moment of that approach. The landscape around her was a record of every failed encounter, frozen at the instant it became fatal. And Medusa lived in the center of that landscape. Surrounded by the stone record of every creature who had tried to come near her. Was that what Athena intended? The sources do not say clearly. The goddess, having accomplished the transformation, does not appear in the accounts of Medusa's subsequent life at the edge of the world. Whatever satisfaction the punishment was meant to provide, whatever divine equation was being balanced by what happened to the mortal girl in the violated temple, that appears to have been satisfied by the act of transformation itself. The ongoing experience of the transformed Medusa, what it was like to be her, in that stone landscape, with the serpents moving on her skull and the knowledge of what her eyes could do, that was not something the goddess appears to have continued to monitor. Which is perhaps one of the most clarifying details in the entire myth. The curse was set. The transformation was accomplished. And then the goddess went back to whatever gods do when they are not directly intervening in mortal lives, which in the Greek tradition means they went back to the endless drama of Olympus, the banquets and the disputes and the competitions and the great ongoing project of managing the world from a position of absolute power and frequently poor judgment. And Medusa remained where she had been left. Her sisters were with her, and this is perhaps worth noting as the one constant mercy in the story. Stheno and Euryale were not separated from her. They remained at the western edge with her, and while we know relatively little about the interior life of the Gorgon sisters, the image of three beings at the world's margin, whatever form they took, however strange their appearance, suggests something that is recognizably a family. A reduced world, but not a completely solitary one. What did they eat? What did they do in the long days and nights of that perpetual twilight? Did they speak to each other in words, or had they moved beyond words into some other mode of communication that belonged to the creature nature they now inhabited? Did Medusa remember the temple? Did she remember what it felt like to move through a world where sunlight was warm and the sacred flame was her responsibility and the goddess's presence was something she could feel in the air around the great stone altar? The myths do not tell us. Mythology is largely uninterested in the interiority of those it has placed in monstrous roles. The monster exists in the story to be encountered, to be fled from, to be eventually defeated. The inner life of the monster, its memories and griefs and ongoing experience of existing in the form it has been given, is typically not what the story pauses to explore. But we can pause here, in the quiet of this telling, and sit with the question. Because one of the things that makes the story of Medusa so persistently interesting, so present in the human imagination across so many centuries, is precisely this gap. The gap between what the story officially tells us and what we cannot help wondering about when we sit with it long enough. The Medusa of the official story is a monster to be killed. The Medusa who emerges from the shadows of the earlier tradition, the priestess, the beautiful daughter of sea gods, the person who was in the wrong place when two divine forces collided, is someone whose inner experience we find ourselves reaching toward, even though the story never fully grants us access to it. We know what she lost. We can estimate what she gained, a terrible kind of power, an isolation that was perhaps also a strange kind of safety. We can imagine the weight of living in a landscape where every creature that came near her was turned to stone, and the silence that must have accumulated around that fact over the long years of her exile. And we can note, with a particular quality of attention, that in some traditions there is a child. Children. Two of them, in fact, born not in the conventional way, but from Medusa's death. When Perseus eventually came and took her head, two beings sprang from her severed neck. Chrysaor, the golden sword giant, and Pegasus, the winged horse, one of the most beloved creatures in all of Greek mythology. These children were Poseidons. Conceived in the temple. Carried through all the years of Medusa's transformation and exile and isolation at the world's edge. And released into the world only by her death. This, too, is worth sitting with. We will return to it in time. Part 7, The Divine Theater of Olympus and the Setting of the Stage. While Medusa lived her stone-edged life at the margin of the world, the divine world continued its complicated business. And in that divine theater, a particular set of pieces was being arranged for a specific purpose, though whether this arrangement was conscious design on the part of any individual god, or simply the way mythological logic moves toward its necessary outcomes, is one of those questions that mythology itself seems uninterested in resolving. The story of Perseus, the hero who would eventually face Medusa, does not begin with Perseus at all. It begins, as so many Greek hero stories do, with a king and a prophecy. King Acrisius of Argos had a daughter whose name was Danae. She was his only child, and he had no son. He went to the oracle at Delphi, that famous place of olive smoke and ambiguous divine utterance, where Apollo spoke through the Pythia in ways that were always true and almost never straightforward, and asked about the future of his bloodline. The oracle told him that his grandson would kill him. This is a very common type of Greek mythological prophecy. It is the kind that cannot be outrun. The more desperately Acrisius tried to prevent the future it described, the more directly his actions would bring it about, because the path of prevention requires exactly the right actions that create the conditions for the prophecy's fulfillment. But Acrisius, like all the kings in these stories who received this kind of news, tried anyway. He locked Danae in an underground chamber, bronze and windowless in some accounts, a tower of bronze in others. He intended to keep her from all men, so that she could never produce the grandson who would one day kill him. He did not, apparently, consider that some men are gods. Zeus, who had a long-established pattern of noticing beautiful mortal women in enclosed spaces, took an interest in Danae. He came to her, as he sometimes did in these particular myths, in a form that was not his own. Not the bull or the swan of other stories, but a shower of golden light, a rain of gold that fell through whatever small opening existed in her bronze enclosure. And from this encounter, this strange, luminous, mythologically opaque event, Danae conceived a child. The child was Perseus, son of Danae, son of Zeus, if the tradition is believed. Future king and future hero, carrying from his first moment of existence the weight of a prophecy that would eventually bring him to the western edge of the world, to a landscape of stone figures, to a sleeping Gorgon and a polished shield. But not yet. When Acrisius discovered the baby, his response was exactly the kind of response that prophecy-addicted Greek kings gave to news they didn't want to receive. He could not kill his daughter, or he felt he could not, the relationship between Greek kings and their daughters being what it was, overlaid with religion and social pressure and genuine affection. He could not kill the infant easily either, for the same reasons. So he put them both in a chest. A great wooden chest, which he sealed and cast into the sea. This act of casting onto the sea is itself charged with mythological significance. To give something to the sea was not quite the same as destroying it. The sea received things. The sea carried things. The sea made its own decisions about what it kept and what it delivered elsewhere. By putting his daughter and grandchild into a wooden chest and casting them on the water, Acrisius was essentially handing the question of their fate to the sea, and therefore, in the mythological logic of his world, to Poseidon. The chest washed ashore on the island of Seriphos. The fisherman who found it was named Dictys, the net man, which may or may not be more than a coincidence for a character who appears at this fishing net intersection of the story. He was kind. He raised Perseus with his mother. He was, in the mythological economy of the story, the mortal shelter that allowed the son of Zeus to survive his infancy and grow. Dictys' brother was the king of Seriphos, Polydectes. And Polydectes, as time passed and Perseus grew from a child into a young man, became obsessed with Danae. He wanted to marry her. she did not want to marry him. Perseus, who was now a young man of considerable spirit and reportedly spectacular origins, stood in the way of the king's ambitions. Polydectes devised a plan of the kind that kings and myths devise when they want a particular inconvenience removed from their lives. He announced that he was wooing a different woman entirely, a woman named Hippodamia, and that he required all his subjects to bring him gifts of horses, as tribute to his courtship. Perseus, who had no horses and was not especially prosperous, made the mistake of saying that if the king didn't want horses, Perseus would bring him anything else he named. The myth records this as a moment of the young man's impulsive generosity or reckless pride, depending on how one reads it. Polydectes named his price, the head of Medusa. The king knew this was almost certainly a death sentence. The Gorgons' gaze turned viewers to stone. The western edge of the world was guarded by the Gree, who would not give up its location easily. Getting there required navigating mythological terrain that had defeated many who tried. Getting close to Medusa required navigating the landscape of stone figures that surrounded her. And doing all of that while simultaneously not looking at her, which was the only way to survive doing all of that, required something that bordered on the impossible. Perseus said yes. And the gods, who had been watching with varying degrees of interest, began to move. Because Perseus was the son of Zeus, or was said to be, or had been designated for certain purposes that required divine support. And so the machinery of divine assistance began to engage around this particular young man and his particular impossible errand. Athena appeared to him. The goddess who had cursed Medusa now became the guide of the hero who would kill her. This alignment, Athena on both sides of the story, as the agent of the curse and the guide of the man who comes to end it, is one of the myth's most interesting structural features, and we will examine it more carefully as the story continues. Part 8: The Gifts of the Gods and the Road to the World's Edge. What does it mean to be helped by the gods? In the Greek mythological tradition, divine assistance was not unconditional. It was not random. It was not particularly warm. It was practical and specific and usually came with an understanding, stated or not, that the assistance served some divine purpose as much as it served the mortal recipient. When Athena and Hermes came to help Perseus on his quest for Medusa's head, they came with items. With tools. With specific, practical things that addressed the specific, practical problems of the mission. Hermes, the quick god, the messenger, the god of roads and travelers and the clever movement between states and places, brought a sickle or sword made of adamantine, the unbreakable divine material. This weapon was suited to the particular work of severing a Gorgon's head. It would not shatter on contact with the serpent-crowned form. It would cut clean. Athena gave Perseus a shield. The shield was polished to a mirror-bright surface, so bright that it could be used as a true reflection device, showing the world around the bearer with enough accuracy to navigate by. This gift from Athena is the one that resonates most deeply in the architecture of the myth. The goddess who had transformed Medusa now provided the tool by which her transformation could be circumvented, by which a mortal could approach the Gorgon without becoming stone. The shield that made Medusa's power irrelevant, as long as you kept your eyes on the reflection rather than the reality. But before Perseus could even reach Medusa, he needed to find her. And to find her, he needed the Gree. The Grey Ones, the three ancient women of Phorcys and Ceto, Medusa's own kinswomen, lived in their perpetual twilight, passing their single eye from hand to hand. They knew the location of the nymphs of the north, who held other items Perseus would need: winged sandals to carry him through the air, a magical bag called the cabesus to safely contain Medusa's severed head, and the helmet of Hades that would make him invisible. The Gree would not give up this knowledge willingly. Perseus had to steal the shared eye as it passed between them, snatching it in the moment of transfer, when none of the three possessed it, and hold it hostage until they agreed to reveal what he needed to know. This encounter with the Gree is worth considering carefully, because these women were Medusa's own kin. Daughters of Phorcys and Ceto, as she was. The three ancient ones who had perhaps known Medusa before her transformation, who perhaps remembered what she had been when the world was different. And they were, by the logic of the story, the gatekeepers who ultimately enabled Perseus to complete his mission. Perseus had to pass through Medusa's family to reach her. He had to take from her kinswomen the information that would lead him to her death. Whether the Gree knew what he intended, whether they knew he was coming to kill their sister or niece, however the relationship is precisely counted, the myths are not clear on. Their information, when extracted, was given unwillingly. They were not helpers in the warm sense. They were compelled. The information was taken from them by a god-supported hero who had a goddess's shield and an unbreakable divine weapon and a destiny that the mythological machinery had already determined. After the Gree came the nymphs of the north, who were more generous, divine keepers of the specific items that would complete Perseus's preparation. The winged sandals allowed him to travel above the earth, which is significant. He approached Medusa's domain from the air, from above, from a direction from which she was perhaps less defended. The cabesus bag would allow him to carry the head without being turned to stone by it. The gaze was deadly even after death, at least in the immediate term, and he would need to contain it safely. The helmet of Hades, the cap of invisibility that belonged to the lord of the underworld, gave him the ability to move unseen. He could approach without being perceived. He could withdraw without being pursued. And finally, winged sandals at his feet, mirror shield on his arm, unbreakable blade in his hand, bag at his side, invisible helmet ready, Perseus went west. He flew west toward the edge of the world, toward the place of perpetual twilight, toward the landscape of stone figures. Toward the three sisters who lived there. He must have seen the stone figures first, from above. Coming down through the strange light of that in-between place, looking down at the ground, and seeing them, the frozen forms of animals and men who had come too close at some point in the long years of the Gorgons' exile. The stone record of every encounter that had gone wrong. He would have understood, from that aerial view, the scope of what he was approaching. And then he would have had to descend. Part 9, the night before the encounter. What would it feel like, to camp at the edge of the world? Perseus, in the mythological account, approached the Gorgons while they slept. This is a significant detail. The attack, if that is the right word for it, and perhaps it is, came while Medusa was resting, her eyes closed, the gaze that could petrify the world temporarily turned inward against darkness rather than outward against the living. The serpents on her head would not have been still, even in sleep. Serpents do not sleep the way mammals do. They slow, they quiet, but they do not fully cease. The serpent hair of the sleeping Gorgon would have been a slow, languid writhing, the serpents still tasting the air in their small restless way, still moving, but without the heightened alertness of full wakefulness. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, slept nearby. the immortal ones. The ones who could not be killed. This is the part of the story that requires us to pause and notice something. Perseus had been told, or had been given the capability to understand, which of the three Gorgons was Medusa, the mortal one. The only one whose head could be taken without immediately killing the taker, because killing an immortal was not something the divine gifts he carried could accomplish. He needed to identify her correctly, in the darkness, among the three sisters who may have looked similar, by the reflected image in his bronze shield. Can you hold that image for a moment? A young man, carrying a polished shield like a mirror, moving carefully through a landscape of stone, in the twilight that serves as both day and night at the edge of the world, trying to read the reflected images in his shield accurately enough to identify which of three sleeping beings he must approach. The winged sandals might have allowed him to move silently. The helmet of Hades kept him invisible. He would have had every advantage that divine assistance could provide. And still, to be that close, and to navigate by reflection, and to know that one wrong direct glance, one moment of natural human reflex toward looking at the thing you're actually approaching rather than its image in a surface, that one mistake would be the last thing you did. He would have needed a quality of attention that was extraordinary. Not the attention of heroic strength or battlefield courage, but the attention of a craftsperson working on something irreversible. The attention of precision. The slow, controlled, methodical kind of bravery. And the sleeping Gorgon would not have known he was coming. This is the part of the story that, in the quiet of honest telling, carries its own discomfort. Medusa had been given her terrible form partly as a kind of armor. She could not be safely approached without special divine tools that almost no one possessed. Her terrible gaze was, in the most pragmatic reading, her defense. It was the one thing that made her, the mortal Gorgon, the vulnerable one, capable of surviving in a world that had already demonstrated it would not protect her. And now a hero came with the precise divine tools needed to bypass that defense. He came while she slept. The mythology does not dwell on this moment as a moral problem. The heroic tradition of the Greek world was not, generally speaking, interested in the perspective of the creature being defeated. The hero's success was the story's purpose. Perseus was the protagonist. Medusa was the obstacle, or the quest object. But the story has always carried, within itself, the other perspective, not stated, but present. The mortal woman who was once a priestess. The daughter of sea gods, exiled to the world's edge after being cursed for something that was done to her. The serpents moving slowly in her sleep, her eyes closed against the stone-strewn dark, her sisters breathing nearby. She does not know he is there. She is sleeping. Let us stay in this moment for a little longer, not to make it more terrible than the myth intends it to be, but to honor what is genuinely present in it. The weight of it. The accumulated loss of it. Everything she had been and everything that had been done to her and everything that had resulted from that, arriving at this quiet twilight moment when a young man with a divine shield is navigating toward her by reflection. There is a kind of mythological truth in this image that exceeds the simple hero and monster framework. The greatest truths in mythology tend to live at the edge of the official story, in the gaps, in the silences, in what is present but not described. Medusa sleeping. Perseus approaching. The serpents slow in their restless curl. And somewhere in the dark of the deeper myth, a woman who once stood in an olive tree-shadowed courtyard and poured libations to a goddess, who once believed that devotion meant protection. Part 10, The Severing and What Flew Free. He moved by reflection. He looked only at the shield. And when he was close enough, when the reflected image in the polished bronze showed him that the distance was right, he raised the unbreakable blade that Hermes had given him. The sickle of adamantine, made for exactly this purpose. He did not look at her face. He kept his gaze on the shield. And he struck. The ancient accounts of this moment are measured and precise in a way that feels almost clinical, which may be the ancient storyteller's way of managing the emotional weight of it. The blade worked. The head was severed. Perseus, in one practiced motion, had accomplished what Polydectes had set as his impossible task. And then something happened. Something that no one quite expected, or that the myth holds in careful reserve until this precise moment, releasing it like a breath that has been held for a very long time. From the severed neck of Medusa, two beings sprang into existence. The first was Chrysaor, the golden-sword one, a giant, carrying from his very first moment of existence the golden sword that would be his defining characteristic. He was, in the mythological accounting, Poseidon's son. Conceived in the temple, carried through all the years of Medusa's transformation, released now into the world at the moment of her death. He would go on to father his own lineage, his own mythological descendants. The second was Pegasus. Pegasus. The winged horse. White as sea foam. Wings the color of the sky just before storm, not threatening, but charged, alive with the same energy that runs through air before lightning. Pegasus, who would become one of the most enduring and beloved images in the entire Greek mythological tradition, the horse that flies, the horse of the Muses, the horse who with one strike of his hoof on the summit of Helicon caused the sacred spring Hippocrene to flow and nourish all the poets who would ever drink from it. He emerged from Medusa. He was Poseidon's son, and Poseidon was the lord of horses as well as the lord of the sea. The horse was sacred to him in a way that went back to very old, very deep mythological roots. The winged horse that became the creature of the Muses, the embodiment of poetic inspiration, the most beautiful being in flight, came from Medusa. Came from her death. Came from the body of the mortal woman who had been cursed for what was done to her in a temple, who had lived in stone-strewn exile at the world's edge for all the years between her transformation and this moment. There is something in this release, this simultaneous destruction and creation, that the Greek mythological imagination clearly found important. The pattern appears elsewhere in the tradition. Death is rarely just subtraction in this world. The great deaths, the deaths the myths choose to dwell on, tend to produce something. Something emerges from the loss, unexpected, beautiful, carrying forward something of what the lost person was in a form that can move freely in the world that the lost person could not. Pegasus would never be turned to stone. Pegasus could not be approached with fear, because he was magnificent. His wings drew eyes toward him rather than away. His presence was inspiring rather than petrifying. He was everything that Medusa's curse had prevented her from being: approachable, marveled at, celebrated, allowed to exist in the world without causing harm. And he carried her blood. And he carried her story, in the way that beautiful things sometimes carry within themselves the history of the difficult origins they came from. Perseus, meanwhile, moved quickly. He had accomplished what he came to do. He placed the head of Medusa into the cabesus, the magical bag that could contain it safely, and prepared to flee. Because Athena and Euryale were waking. The immortal sisters came awake to the absence of Medusa. And what happened then, what the sound was, what the air felt like in that twilight place when the two immortal Gorgons understood what had occurred, the myth contains a detail that is quietly devastating. They wept. They could not die. They could not be killed by the same stroke that had taken Medusa. And so their grief had nowhere to go, it could not end in death, it could not be resolved by some divine intervention, it simply persisted. The way that the grief of immortals always persists, without the mercy of an ending. Perseus, invisible in his cap of Hades, flew away on his winged sandals. He carried the head of Medusa in the bag. Behind him, the stone landscape of the Gorgons' world grew distant. Ahead of him, other adventures waited. He would save Andromeda from a sea monster, he would return to Seriphos and confront Polydectes with the Gorgon's head, he would eventually, accidentally, fulfill the prophecy about Acrisius. But the myth follows the head, as well as the hero. And the head retained its power. Perseus used it as a weapon more than once, turning enemies to stone by producing it from the bag and averting his own eyes. The petrifying gaze outlasted Medusa herself, at least for a time. Eventually, the head came to Athena. Perseus gave it to the goddess who had guided him, as a kind of final tribute. And Athena placed it on her breastplate, the aegis, the divine armor that was already terrible and now became more so. The face of Medusa, worked into the center of Athena's aegis, became the goddess's permanent emblem of terrifying power. The goddess wore the face of the woman she had cursed, as a symbol of her own divine authority. Whatever it means, and the myth has been generating interpretations of this particular detail for more than 2,000 years, it is not a simple conclusion. It is the kind of mythological ending that opens outward rather than closing, that raises more questions than it resolves, that insists on being thought about rather than simply accepted. Part 11 echoes across the ancient world and the myth's long life. No myth exists in isolation. The story of Medusa, what she was before the curse, what the curse made her, what came from her death, is one of the most echoed and referenced stories in the entire ancient world. It does not belong only to one moment or one culture. It traveled, as myths travel, along trade routes and sea lanes and through the conversations of merchants and sailors and scholars, accumulating new interpretations as it moved, shedding some details and gaining others, always remaining recognizable at its core while wearing different surfaces in different places and times. The oldest versions of the Gorgon image, the face with the staring eyes, the serpents, the terrible gaze, appear in Greek art long before the surviving literary sources. The Gorgonian, as scholars call this image, turns up in decorative contexts that suggest it was used as an apotropaic symbol. A protective emblem. Something placed at the entrance of a space or inscribed on an object to ward off evil, to turn its petrifying gaze outward, against anything that might threaten the person or place it guarded. The earliest Gorgon images in Greek art predate the literary mythologies by centuries in some cases. They appear on painted pottery, on temple architectural elements, on personal ornaments. They stare outward from shields and doors and the facades of sacred buildings, that characteristic forward-facing, full-face gaze that is unusual in ancient Greek art, where profile views were far more common. Something about the Gorgon face demanded full frontal presentation. It was, in a sense, unavoidable. You could not encounter it in profile and feel its force. It had to look directly at you to do what it did, which is also, curiously, the condition of being looked at by someone in the act of genuine recognition. To be fully seen is always slightly terrifying. To look at something that fully sees you back is always slightly arresting. The apotropaic use of the Gorgonian tells us something important about how the ancient Greeks understood what Medusa represented. She was terrifying, yes. Her gaze was deadly, yes. But deadly to what? The assumption embedded in the protective use of her image was that there were things worse than Medusa, things that needed to be stopped, repelled, frozen in their tracks. And Medusa's face was the instrument of that freezing. She protected, even as she terrified. The monster was also the guardian. This doubling, the dangerous thing that also defends, appears across many world mythologies. The Hindu goddess Kali, who is terrifying in her aspect but deeply protective of her devotees. The Japanese Oni, fearsome in appearance but sometimes protective when correctly approached. The gargoyles of medieval European architecture, frightening faces posted at the corners of sacred buildings to drive away evil influences. Medusa belongs to this tradition, the protective monster, the terrible face that stands between the interior and whatever threatens from outside. After her death, incorporated into Athena's aegis, this protective quality was made literal and permanent. She became part of a goddess's armor. Her gaze, which had been her own terrible inheritance, became divine weaponry. In Rome, where the Greek myths were absorbed, reinterpreted, and retransmitted through Latin literary tradition, Medusa's story gained new layers. Ovid's version in the Metamorphoses, written near the turn of the Common Era, in that fertile moment of Roman literary sophistication, is one of the most influential single retellings of the myth in the Western tradition. It is Ovid who gives us the clearest account of Medusa's beauty before the curse, her prideful comparison of her hair to Athena's domain, the encounter with Poseidon, in the Roman telling, Neptune, and the goddess's punishing transformation. Ovid was not simply recording the myth. He was engaged in his own project of interpretation, in a tradition that was already several centuries old by his time. The Metamorphoses is a poem fundamentally concerned with transformation, with what changes and what persists through change, with identity and its instability, with the body as a site where divine power writes its most permanent messages. Medusa's story was, in this context, one example among hundreds, but a particularly resonant one. Because the question of what persists through transformation is answered, in her case, with notable complexity. Her beauty was transformed. Her identity as a priestess was destroyed. But her power, a different kind of power, terrible rather than gentle, persisted. Her children persisted. Her gaze persisted beyond her death. The serpent nature persisted in the blood that fell from the bag Perseus carried. Something always remained. In the centuries following the Roman tradition, the myth continued to travel and to change. Medieval European cultures, encountering the classical myths through scholarly transmission rather than living religious tradition, interpreted Medusa through the lens of their own symbolic frameworks. She became associated with the dangers of the physical world, with the flesh's tendency to distract from spiritual concerns. The petrifying gaze was sometimes read as an allegory for the way sin or vice could immobilize the soul. The Renaissance brought her into the world of art with new intensity. Some of the most remarkable visual representations of the Medusa head belong to this period, painters and sculptors working with the classical image but investing it with contemporary psychological interest. Caravaggio's famous Medusa, painted on a shield, shows the severed head in the moment of its own horrified self-recognition, the serpents in vivid motion, the face expressing something that is not quite human but is not quite inhuman either. It is the face of someone who knows what has just happened to them. This quality, Medusa as subject rather than simply object, as someone who experiences rather than simply causing experience, is one that recurred in the visual tradition with increasing frequency as the centuries progressed. Artists seemed drawn to the question behind the image: what did she see, in the last moment? What did she know? And in the modern era, the myth has been particularly active in feminist criticism and reinterpretation. The French philosopher Hélène Cixous wrote a celebrated essay called The Laugh of the Medusa in 1975, which used the Medusa myth as a starting point for thinking about women's writing and women's power. Cixous's intervention: she argued that if you look at Medusa directly, she is not terrifying but rather beautiful and laughing, inverted the myth's fundamental dynamic. She turned the petrifying gaze into something else entirely. Something transformative rather than simply destructive. This is one of the things that myths do across the long arc of their life. They become sites for each generation's thinking about its own deepest concerns. The myth of Medusa has been capacious enough to hold allegories for sin, for the dangers of female beauty, for the psychology of trauma, for the power of female creativity, for the way institutions respond to those they should protect, for the experience of being transformed by forces outside your control. None of these readings is wrong. Or rather, myths are not the kind of thing that can be read wrongly, in the same way that a dream cannot be interpreted incorrectly if the interpretation arrives at something true about the person interpreting. What matters, in the long life of this particular myth, is that it has never stopped mattering. 26 centuries or more of human beings, in different languages and different cultures and different historical circumstances, have found in the story of Medusa something that resonated with their own experience of the world. The woman transformed by divine power into something frightening. The beauty that became dangerous. The mortal, in a world of immortal forces, trying to survive. The thing that could only be approached in reflection. All of this continues to mean something. It continues to find its way into new tellings, new artworks, new ways of understanding the old story. Which suggests that the story is not finished. Which suggests that myths, like certain kinds of sea creatures, do not die so much as transform. They shed one form and take another, and continue moving through the water. Part 12, The Meaning We Carry Home and the Myth's Deepest Gift. We have traveled a long way tonight. From the edge of the world where Phorcys and Ceto kept their ancient household of sea-strange children. Through the temple by the sea where a mortal woman with ocean-dark hair poured libations to the grey-eyed goddess. Through the violent intersection of two divine forces in a sacred space. Through the transformation, the serpents and the gaze and the terrible change that no prayer could undo. Through the western exile and the stone landscape and the long years of isolated existence at the world's margin. Through the divine preparations of a young hero with impossible gifts. Through the night of approach and the severing and the two bright beings that flew free. Through the centuries of the myth's long life in human culture, the way it traveled unchanged and continued to resonate across millennia. And now we rest here, at the end of the telling, in the quiet that comes after a long story is finally allowed to breathe. What do we carry home from this journey? There is always a question, with myths, about what we are supposed to take from them. The ancient Greeks had a complex relationship with this question. Their myths were not simple fables with clearly stated morals. They were stories that contained contradictions, gods who were wise and foolish, powerful and petty, capable of great generosity and terrible cruelty, sometimes in the same breath. Heroes who did glorious things through means that would trouble a modern moral sensibility. Monsters who had once been something else and might yet become something else again. The story of Medusa before she became a monster contains several things that are worth carrying gently into sleep. The first is this: identity is not fixed. Medusa began as one thing and became another, by forces entirely outside her control. And this is perhaps the most universally resonant aspect of her myth, the experience of being changed by something you did not choose, of looking in the bronze mirror one day and finding someone you do not quite recognize. The self is not as solid as we sometimes need it to feel. It is more fluid. It changes under pressure. And the question the myth poses, not quite answering it, but posing it with great clarity, is what persists through transformation. What remains when everything visible has changed? Something always remains. Something always continues. Whatever the transformation has taken, it cannot take everything. The second thing worth carrying is this: the most powerful things can only sometimes be approached in reflection. Perseus could not look directly at Medusa and survive. He navigated by her image in the polished shield, by the reflection of the thing rather than the thing itself. And this is not only a survival strategy, it is also a way of knowing. Some things are too large, too bright, too overwhelming to be stared at directly. The myths themselves function this way. We approach certain overwhelming truths, about mortality, about divine indifference, about the way power moves through the world, sideways, in story, in reflection, in the mediated form of narrative that softens the direct impact enough to allow understanding. This is what myths are for. They are the polished shield. They hold the image of things we cannot safely look at with undivided eyes, and they show us that image in a form we can navigate by. The story of Medusa, the real story, the full story, from the ocean parents to the violated temple to the exile to the death and the flying horse, is a story about things that are genuinely difficult to look at directly. About power and violation and divine indifference and the transformation of identity by forces outside our control and the persistence of beauty in unexpected forms. But told this way, slowly, in the dark, at the pace of a long night, it becomes something navigable. Something we can carry without being crushed by. The third thing is perhaps the most quiet, the most easily missed, and therefore worth naming specifically. From her death came Pegasus, the winged horse, the creature of the muses, the one whose hoofstrike on the mountain caused the spring of inspiration to flow for every poet who ever came after. The embodiment of creative flight, of the imagination's capacity to carry us beyond ordinary gravity. He came from Medusa. From her loss and her ending and the accumulated grief of everything that had been done to her and everything she had been made to become. From the most broken place in the story, the most irreversible moment, the thing from which there was no returning, from there came a creature of extraordinary beauty, who made it possible for human beings to make poetry. This is the myth's deepest gift, and it is a gift that does not diminish with the taking. The human capacity to create beauty, to make art and music and poetry and story, has always coexisted with loss. The greatest creative works do not come from comfort. They come from exactly the kind of territory that Medusa inhabited, the margins, the exile, the transformations that are not of our choosing, the long years in the stone landscape with only the serpents for company. Pegasus did not ask where he came from. He simply flew. The spring of Hippocrene, which flowed from his hoof-strike, did not discriminate between poets who had suffered greatly and poets who had lived gently. It simply flowed, and offered itself to whoever came to drink. And the poets came across the centuries, and drank, and made what they made from what they found in themselves and in the world. And one of the things they made, over and over, in different languages and different forms, was the story of Medusa. The woman before the monster. The priestess before the Gorgon. The mortal at the intersection of divine forces too large for her to navigate. The beauty that was changed into something dangerous. The death from which beauty flew. They kept telling it because it kept being true. Not factually true, myths are not documentaries, and the ancient Greeks knew this as well as we do. But true in the deeper sense, the sense in which certain images and certain stories capture something about the nature of experience that resists being captured any other way. True the way the image of something terrible reflected in a polished shield is true, not the thing itself, but the recognizable shape of it, navigable, survivable, carrying enough of the original to let us understand what we are looking at. That is the myth of Medusa. That is what it has always been. Not the story of a monster. The story of a person who was made into one, and what she carried within her, and what flew free from her, and what has never stopped flying since. Let that fly with you now, into sleep. Let it carry you above the stone landscape, above the world's edge, into the cleaner air where winged things move without effort. The story is complete. The telling is done. The night holds it now, as the night holds all stories told in the dark, gently, without judgment, with the particular patience of things that have always been awake while the world sleeps. Closing meditation. You have traveled very far tonight. Through ocean and temple and exile and divine anger and the long still dark of the world's edge. Through the mythology of a woman who was more than what the most familiar version of her story allows. Through the ancient layers of a myth that has been traveling through human culture for more than 2 millennia, gathering meaning as it goes. You do not need to carry any of it consciously right now. The mind that listens to stories holds them in its own way, in the layer that processes while the conscious self rests. Whatever was useful, whatever resonated, whatever the myth has to offer you, it will find its way to where it needs to be. Let your breath settle now. Long and slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth, and as you breathe out, let the whole journey release. The ocean parents. The temple. The serpents. The shield. The winged horse rising into the first light beyond the edge of the world. Let them all settle like silt to the bottom of still water, where they will rest quietly until they are needed. You are safe. You are here. The mythological world is held at the comfortable distance that all good stories maintain, close enough to touch, far enough not to overwhelm. The gods are in their places. The heroes have completed their tasks. The Gorgons sleep at the world's edge. And somewhere on a mountain in the ancient imagination, a white horse with enormous wings stands still for a moment at the lip of a spring, and drinks, and lifts his head, and shakes his great mane in the particular light that exists only at the edge of story and sleep. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the story's warmth remain without the story's images. Let yourself drift now, slowly, without effort, into the quiet that the ancient world always kept just beyond the last word of the last tale told by firelight. This has been the story of Medusa, before she became a monster. And you have held it beautifully. Sleep well, now. Sleep. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.